The flames illuminated the night sky as Margaret Prentiss clutched her children to her chest, the roaring inferno below them consuming everything she had built over the past 5 years. The year was 1878, and Lordsburg, New Mexico, was still just a dusty collection of wooden structures that seemed to invite disaster. Now, trapped in the upper floor of her modest home with 7-year-old Emma and 4-year-old Thomas, Margaret could only pray for a miracle as the smoke grew thicker and the wooden floorboards beneath them began to warm ominously. "Mama, I'm scared," Emma whimpered, her small hands gripping Margaret's nightgown with such force that her knuckles had gone white. "Hush now," Margaret soothed, though her own voice quavered with terror. "We'll be all right." The lie tasted bitter on her tongue. The staircase was already engulfed, and the window offered only a 20-foot drop to the hard-packed earth below. With both children in tow, there would be no way to climb down safely. "Help!" she screamed again, her throat raw from the smoke and repeated cries. "Please, somebody help us." The commotion outside had grown, but the bucket brigade that had formed seemed pitifully inadequate against the raging fire that had already claimed the general store next door and now threatened to consume the entire eastern side of Main Street. Lordsburg was still too small for a proper fire department, relying instead on the goodwill and quick actions of its citizens. Margaret had almost given up hope when she heard the sound of something heavy landing on the roof outside their window. A moment later, a face appeared, backlit by the orange glow of the flames. Dust-covered and weathered with eyes as sharp as a hawk's, the stranger peered in through the glass panes. "Stand back, madam," the man called out, his voice carrying the distinctive drawl of Texas. Margaret pulled her children into the corner furthest from the window as the stranger smashed the glass with his elbow, clearing away the jagged edges with the sleeve of his leather coat, before hoisting himself through the opening. He landed with surprising grace for a man of his size, his spurs jingling slightly as his boots hit the wooden floor. "Name's Zachary Yates," he said, tipping his hat briefly before surveying the room with practiced efficiency. "Folks call me Zach. Reckon we don't have much time before this whole place comes down." He wasn't wrong. The floor beneath them had grown hot enough that Margaret could feel it through her thin-soled house slippers, and the crackling of the fire had taken on a hungry, almost living quality. "My children first," Margaret insisted, pushing Emma forward. Zachary nodded, crouching down to the little girl's level. "Hello there, miss. You ready to go on an adventure with me?" Emma looked uncertainly between the stranger and her mother, her eyes wide with fear. "It's all right, Emma," Margaret assured her. "This nice man is going to help us." "Hold tight around my neck, little lady," Zachary instructed, turning to allow Emma to climb onto his back. "Like riding a horse, you understand. Don't let go no matter what." With Emma secured, Zachary moved back to the window and peered out. "There's a slope on the side roof that leads down to the water trough. I'll take her down, then come back for the boy, and then you, madam." "Please hurry," Margaret whispered, the smoke growing thicker by the moment. With a reassuring nod, Zachary climbed out the window with Emma clinging to his back like a determined little monkey. Margaret held her breath as they disappeared from view, holding Thomas close and whispering prayers into his dark hair. True to his word, Zachary returned less than a minute later, his face now streaked with soot but his movements still decisive. "Your turn, young man," he said, reaching for Thomas. The little boy buried his face in his mother's nightgown. "No, Mama." "Thomas, please," Margaret begged, her eyes stinging from the smoke. "You must go with Mr. Yates. I'll be right behind you." With gentle but firm hands, Zachary took the boy. "I've got him, madam, back in a jiffy." The wait seemed interminable this time. Margaret could hear the timbers groaning beneath her, and a sudden crash from somewhere below told her that part of the structure had already collapsed. She moved closer to the window, gasping for the marginally fresher air it provided. When Zachary finally reappeared, his expression was grim. "Floor's getting mighty unstable, madam. We need to move now." He extended his hand, and Margaret took it without hesitation, allowing him to help her through the window. The heat from the fire below was intense, radiating up through the shingles beneath her feet. Zachary kept a firm grip on her hand as they inched along the sloped roof toward the edge, where a small overhang provided the path down to safety. "Just follow me exactly," he instructed. "Step where I step." They had made it halfway when a tremendous crack split the air, and Margaret felt the roof shift beneath her. Zachary's hand tightened around hers as he pulled her forward urgently. "Run!" he shouted, abandoning caution. They raced the last few feet as the roof began to collapse behind them. Zachary leapt first onto the lower overhang, then turned to catch Margaret as she jumped after him. For one horrifying moment, she felt nothing beneath her, just the searing heat of the fire and the pull of gravity. Then strong arms caught her, steadying her against a solid chest. "I've got you," Zachary said, his voice low and certain near her ear. Together they slid down the remaining section of roof, Zachary controlling their descent as best he could, until they dropped the last few feet into the water trough below. The cold water was a shocking contrast to the heat of the fire, and Margaret gasped as she surfaced, immediately looking around for her children. "Mama!" Two small voices cried out in unison, and Margaret turned to see Emma and Thomas rushing toward her, shepherded by a kindly-looking older woman. "They're just fine, dear," the woman assured her as Margaret gathered her children into her arms. "Not a scratch on either of them, thanks to this brave young man." Zachary had climbed out of the trough and was wringing water from his hat, looking uncomfortable with the praise. "Just happened to be in the right place," he said gruffly. "You saved our lives," Margaret said, looking up at him with tears streaming clean tracks down her soot-stained face. "I don't know how I can ever repay you." Zachary replaced his damp hat and offered a small, crooked smile. "No need for that, madam. Anyone would have done the same." But as Margaret looked around at the gathered townspeople, many still working to contain the fire that had claimed her home and livelihood, she knew that wasn't true. It took a special kind of courage to climb into a burning building and an even rarer kind of man to go back in twice more. "You have somewhere to go, Mrs." the older woman asked, trailing off questioningly. "Prentiss. Margaret Prentiss," she supplied. "And no, everything we had was in that house. You can stay with me and my husband," the woman offered. "I'm Martha Wilson. We have plenty of room at our place just outside of town." "That's very kind, but I couldn't impose nonsense," Martha interrupted firmly. "It's what neighbors do." As the Wilsons led Margaret and her children away from the still burning buildings, she glanced back to find Zachary watching them go, his tall figure silhouetted against the flames. Their eyes met briefly before he tipped his hat once more and turned away, disappearing into the crowd of townspeople still fighting to save what remained of their main street. Margaret didn't know then that the stranger who had plucked her family from certain death would soon become far more than just a passing hero in their lives. As she clutched her children close and walked away from the ruins of her old life, she couldn't have imagined that from these ashes would rise something beautiful and unexpected, a second chance at happiness, and a love story that would become legend in the small frontier town of Lordsburg. The Wilsons' home was a modest but comfortable two-story structure about a mile outside of town. Margaret and her children were given the spare bedroom, a cozy space with a large bed that easily accommodated all three of them. As she tucked Emma and Thomas beneath the homespun quilt, their exhausted little bodies finally surrendering to sleep. Margaret allowed her own tears to fall silently. Everything was gone: William's photographs, the children's baby shoes, the wedding ring she'd kept in a small box since his death from typhoid 5 years earlier. All the tangible reminders of their life before Lordsburg had been consumed by the fire. All that remained were the nightclothes they wore and the locket containing William's likeness that hung around her neck. Martha Wilson appeared in the doorway, bearing a steaming cup of tea and a sympathetic smile. "They're resilient children," she said softly, nodding toward Emma and Thomas. "More so than we sometimes give them credit for." Margaret accepted the tea gratefully. "I don't know what we're going to do," she whispered. "The millinery shop was everything. All our savings were invested in the inventory." After William's death, Margaret had used what little money they had to purchase the small hat shop in Lordsburg, recognizing that the growing town needed such services. She'd built a modest but loyal clientele over the past few years, enough to keep her children fed and clothed. Now that security had literally gone up in smoke. "One day at a time," Martha advised, patting Margaret's hand. "First, get some rest. Things often look different in the morning light." But morning brought little clarity, only the stark reality of their situation. Thomas awakened crying for his wooden horse, a toy his father had carved for him before his death. Emma silently clutched her mother's hand as they rode into town with Mr. Wilson to survey the damage. Main Street was a scene of devastation. The fire had consumed Margaret's shop and home, the general store, the barber shop, and damaged several other buildings before finally being contained. Men were already clearing debris, the community pulling together as frontier towns must do to survive. "Mrs. Prentiss." Margaret turned to see Sheriff Davis approaching, his weathered face creased with concern beneath his gray mustache. "I'm mighty sorry about your place," he said, removing his hat. "I've been asking around about how it started. Seems it might have been deliberate." Margaret repeated, struggling to comprehend. "You mean someone set the fire?" The sheriff nodded grimly. "Found evidence of coal oil around the back of the general store. Mr. Phillips says he'd had trouble with some drifters earlier in the day, refused to sell them liquor when they were already 3 sheets to the wind." "But why would they?" Margaret couldn't finish the question, her mind reeling at the thought that her family's tragedy had been intentionally caused. "Sometimes men don't need much reason, especially when drink's involved," the sheriff said. "I've sent telegrams to neighboring towns to be on the lookout. We'll find them." Margaret nodded numbly, her gaze drifting to the charred timbers that had once been her home. A movement caught her attention, a familiar tall figure shifting through the debris, examining what remained of the structure with careful attention. "Your cowboy's been helping all morning," Sheriff Davis remarked, following her gaze. "Organized the men into teams to clear the worst of it. Says he's got experience rebuilding after fires." "He's not my cowboy," Margaret corrected automatically, though she felt a strange flutter in her chest at the sight of Zachary Yates. In the daylight, she could see him more clearly, broad-shouldered and lean-hipped in the way of men who spent most of their lives in the saddle, with dark hair that curled slightly where it emerged beneath his hat. As if sensing her scrutiny, Zachary looked up, their eyes meeting across the distance. He straightened, dusting off his hands before making his way toward them. "Mrs. Prentiss," he greeted, tipping his hat. His voice was deeper than she remembered, with that distinctive Texas drawl that softened the edges of his words. "How are the little ones?" "They're well, thanks to you," Margaret replied. "Mr. Yates, I don't know how to express my gratitude." He waved away her words. "Like I said, anyone would have done the same." "Not everyone would have succeeded," Sheriff Davis interjected. "That was some mighty fine work, son." Zachary accepted the compliment with a slight nod before turning back to Margaret. "I've been looking over what's left. The fire was hottest at the store next door, which is why your place went up so quick. But the foundation's solid. Could be rebuilt without too much trouble." "I appreciate the assessment, but I'm afraid I don't have the means to rebuild," Margaret admitted. "Everything I had was invested in the shop." "The town will help," Sheriff Davis assured her. "We take care of our own in Lordsburg." Zachary studied her face for a moment, his expression unreadable. "I might be able to assist with that. I've done construction work before, and I'm at loose ends for the next few weeks anyway." Margaret blinked in surprise. "That's very generous, but I couldn't accept considerate payment," he interrupted. "Payment? For what?" A slow smile spread across his face, transforming his serious features. "Been looking for a place to winter. Lordsburg seems as good as any. I need lodging, and you'll need income once your place is rebuilt. Perhaps we could come to an arrangement." Sheriff Davis cleared his throat meaningfully. "Mrs. Prentiss is a widow with 2 young children, Mr. Yates. I'm sure you understand that appearances must be considered." "Of course," Zachary replied smoothly. "I meant no disrespect. I can bunk at the livery until the rebuilding is complete. After that, perhaps the upstairs room could be rented out properly." Margaret considered the offer. Having a tenant would provide steady income while she rebuilt her business. And something about Zachary Yates inspired trust, despite his being a virtual stranger. The way he had risked his life for her children spoke volumes about his character. "I would need to think about it," she said finally. "There are many uncertainties right now." Zachary nodded. "Take all the time you need, madam. I'll be around." As he walked away to rejoin the cleanup efforts, Sheriff Davis leaned closer to Margaret. "I've made some inquiries about him. Seems he rode with the Texas Rangers for a spell, then did some cattle driving. No one's got a bad word to say about him, which is unusual for a man who moves around as much as he does. He said he was looking for a place to winter. Does that mean he'll leave come spring?" Margaret asked, surprised by the twinge of disappointment she felt at the thought. "Most cowboys do," the sheriff replied with a shrug. "It's in their nature, like migratory birds, but some find a reason to put down roots eventually." Over the next few days, Margaret was overwhelmed by the generosity of the townspeople. The Wilsons insisted she and the children stay as long as needed. Ladies from the church brought clothing and toys. Mr. Phillips, despite losing his own store in the fire, provided credit for necessities from the temporary shop he'd set up in his brother's front parlor. But it was Zachary Yates who proved the most unexpected source of support. True to his word, he organized volunteers and began clearing the debris from Margaret's property. By the end of the first week, the foundation had been deemed sound and work had begun on the frame of the new structure. Margaret found herself drawn to the construction site daily, ostensibly to check on progress, but increasingly to observe the tall cowboy who seemed to have appointed himself foreman of the project. She noticed how he took time to explain things to young Thomas, who watched the construction with fascination. How he always had a kind word for Emma, who was still quiet and withdrawn following the trauma of the fire. One afternoon, as October winds blew dust through the streets of Lordsburg, Margaret arrived with a basket of sandwiches for the workers. She found Zachary alone, measuring timber with meticulous care. "The others gone to lunch?" she asked, setting down her basket. Zachary straightened, pushing his hat back slightly. "Gave them the afternoon off. Railroads hiring day laborers to unload freight, and most of these men could use the extra money." "That was thoughtful of you," she gestured to the basket. "I brought food if you're hungry." A genuine smile crossed his face. "Been living on jerky and coffee most of the day. A real sandwich sounds like heaven, Mrs. Prentiss." "Please call me Margaret," she said, surprising herself with the invitation to familiarity. They sat on stacked lumber, sharing the simple meal as the autumn sun warmed the construction site. For the first time, Margaret felt comfortable enough to ask the question that had been on her mind. "What brings a Texas Ranger to Lordsburg, Mr. Yates?" He seemed momentarily surprised by her knowledge, then gave a rueful chuckle. "Small towns. Word travels fast." "Sheriff Davis made some inquiries," she admitted. "For the children's sake." "Sensible," he nodded approvingly. "And its former ranger. Haven't worn that star in nearly 2 years." He took a bite of his sandwich, chewing thoughtfully before continuing. "As for why Lordsburg, I was heading to Arizona Territory. Heard there might be work with the cavalry as a scout. Your town was just a convenient stop along the way." "Until the fire," Margaret said softly. Something flickered in his eyes. "Until the fire," he agreed. "Though I'm starting to think it might have been Providence rather than coincidence that put me in that saloon when someone came running and shouting about Main Street being ablaze." They fell silent for a moment, both contemplating the strange twists of fate that had brought them together. "The children have been asking about you," Margaret said finally. "Especially Thomas. He's decided he wants to be a cowboy when he grows up." Zachary laughed, a rich, warm sound that Margaret found herself wanting to hear again. "Smart boy, though his mama might prefer he choose a profession with more regular hours and less getting shot at." "His father was a schoolteacher," Margaret said, a wistful smile touching her lips at the memory of William. "He loved books and learning. I always imagined Thomas might follow in his footsteps." "He still might," Zachary replied. "Plenty of time for a boy his age to try on different futures for size." The conversation drifted to the rebuilding plans. Zachary had designed the new structure with practical improvements: better insulation, a more efficient stove, wider stairs. "I took the liberty of expanding the upstairs," he explained, showing her the rough sketches he'd made. "There'll be 2 proper bedrooms for you and the children, plus the room at the back that could serve as rental space. Separate entrance from the outside so your privacy isn't disturbed." Margaret studied the plans, touched by the thoughtfulness they represented. "You've put a great deal of consideration into this." "Been living on the move for most of my life," he said with a shrug. "Makes a man appreciate the details of a proper home." As they talked, Margaret began to see glimpses of the man behind the quiet, competent exterior: his dry humor, his intelligence, his fundamental decency. By the time she gathered her basket to leave, she had made a decision. "Mr. Yates Zachary," she corrected herself. "If you're still interested in renting the room once it's built, I'd be pleased to have you as a tenant." Something like pleasure crossed his face, quickly masked by a casual nod. "Appreciate that, Margaret. I'll try to be a quiet neighbor." As October gave way to November, the rebuilding progressed rapidly. The unusually mild autumn weather held, allowing work to continue uninterrupted. Margaret found herself spending more time at the site, sometimes helping with smaller tasks, but often simply watching the transformation taking place. Emma and Thomas became fixtures as well, running to the construction site after their school day ended. Margaret noticed that Zachary always seemed to have small jobs ready for them, tasks that made them feel included while keeping them safely away from any danger. Thomas would proudly carry small loads of nails or hold the end of a measuring string, while Emma helped sort hardware and fetched water for the workers. "You're very patient with them," Margaret remarked one evening as she and Zachary sat on the newly constructed front steps, watching the children play a game of tag with some other town children in the dusty street. "They're good kids," he replied. "Smart, too. Thomas has a real head for numbers." "Been teaching him to calculate board feet," Margaret smiled, warmed by his obvious affection for her children. "They've grown attached to you." "Feelings mutual," he admitted, his gaze still on the playing children. "Haven't been around little ones much in my life. It's nice." There was something wistful in his tone that made Margaret wonder about the life he'd led before arriving in Lordsburg. The bits and pieces she'd gathered painted a picture of constant movement, the rangers, cattle drives, scouting, a life with little opportunity for permanent connections. "Will you really stay the winter?" she asked, voicing the question that had been on her mind. Zachary turned to look at her, his eyes reflecting the golden light of the setting sun. "I gave my word, didn't I?" "Yes, but circumstances change. The cavalry position you mentioned can wait," he said simply. "Or not happen at all. I'm finding I like it here in Lordsburg." Their gazes held for a moment longer than was strictly proper, and Margaret felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the mild evening air. She looked away first, calling to the children that it was time to return to the Wilsons for supper. As they walked away, Emma slipped her small hand into Zachary's, chattering about something she'd learned in school that day. The sight of her usually reserved daughter so comfortable with the tall cowboy stirred something in Margaret's heart, a feeling she had thought long buried with William. That night, after the children were asleep, Margaret found herself sitting by the window of the Wilsons' guest room, fingering the locket that contained William's portrait. For the first time since his death, she felt a confusion of emotions when she looked at his familiar features. "I'm not forgetting you," she whispered to the tiny image. "But the children need stability, a home." She paused, unable to articulate even to herself the other need that was awakening inside her, the longing for companionship, for the kind of partnership she had once known. As November progressed, the new building took shape with remarkable speed. The community effort, spearheaded by Zachary's expertise, had accomplished in weeks what might normally have taken months. By Thanksgiving, the structure was enclosed with windows installed and a solid roof overhead. The holiday itself brought an unexpected invitation. Zachary, who had been boarding at the livery stable as promised, asked if Margaret and the children would join him for a Thanksgiving meal at the hotel restaurant. "It's not charity," he insisted when he saw her hesitation. "Consider it a celebration of progress. The building's coming along fine, and that's worth marking." Margaret accepted, touched by the gesture and aware that the children would be delighted. Emma had taken to drawing pictures of Mr. Zach, as she called him, while Thomas peppered everyone with facts and figures he had learned from his new hero. The Occidental Hotel had decorated its dining room with autumn garlands and candles for the occasion. Several other families were present, creating a festive atmosphere that was a welcome change from the Wilsons' quiet household. Though the elderly couple had been extraordinarily generous, Margaret was increasingly aware of the need to establish her own home again. Zachary had dressed for the occasion in what was clearly his best shirt, his hair neatly combed and his usually stubbled jaw cleanly shaven. The transformation highlighted the strong lines of his face, making him appear younger and somehow more vulnerable. "You look very nice, Mr. Zach," Emma said with the direct honesty of an 8-year-old. "Why, thank you, Miss Emma," he replied solemnly. "You're looking mighty pretty yourself." The meal was the most elaborate Margaret had seen since arriving in Lordsburg, roast turkey with all the trimmings, followed by pumpkin pie with real whipped cream. The children's eyes grew round at the abundance, and even Margaret found herself relaxing and enjoying the luxury of a meal she hadn't had to prepare. As they ate, Zachary entertained them with stories of his travels carefully edited for young ears, she noted. Tales of cattle drives across the Leno Estacado, of nights beneath stars so thick they looked like spilled sugar, of buffalo herds that darkened the horizon like storm clouds. "Did you ever shoot a buffalo?" Thomas asked eagerly. A shadow crossed Zachary's face. "Only for food, never for sport," he said. The waste of those great beasts was a terrible thing to witness. Margaret recognized the reference to the mass buffalo hunts that had devastated the herds and, by extension, the native tribes that depended on them. It was a sensitive topic in the territories, where conflicts between settlers and indigenous peoples remained a painful reality. "Have you known many Indians?" Thomas persisted, using the term commonly applied to the native peoples. "I have," Zachary replied carefully. "Worked alongside Comanche scouts with the Rangers. Learned tracking from a Cherokee man in the Nations. They're people, Thomas, same as anyone, some good, some not so good." Margaret appreciated his measured response. The way he avoided both romanticizing and demonizing perspectives, all too common in frontier towns. The conversation shifted to lighter topics, and by the time they finished their dessert, even Emma was giggling at Zachary's story about a particularly stubborn mule he'd once owned. As they walked back toward the Wilsons' home in the crisp evening air, Thomas and Emma ran ahead, their energy seemingly undiminished by the large meal. Zachary offered Margaret his arm, a gentlemanly gesture she accepted with only slight hesitation. "Thank you for tonight," she said. "The children haven't been this happy since before the fire." "My pleasure," he replied. "Though I should be thanking you for the company, holidays can be lonely times for a man on his own." Margaret glanced up at his profile, struck again by the complexity of this man who had entered their lives so dramatically. "Have you never thought of settling down, having a family of your own?" He was quiet for several steps. "Came close once," he finally said. 7 years back. She was a rancher's daughter outside of Austin, pretty as a sunrise and twice as spirited. "What happened?" Margaret asked softly. Her father didn't think a ranger made suitable husband material, too much danger, too little stability. His mouth quirked in a humorless smile. "He wasn't wrong, I suppose. She married a banker instead. Has 3 children now, I hear. I'm sorry." "Don't be," he said, his voice lightening. "It all works out the way it's supposed to, I reckon. If things had gone differently there, I wouldn't have been in Lordsburg when a certain millinery shop caught fire." The implication of his words that meeting her and her children had been worth the past disappointment warmed Margaret even as it unsettled her. It had been a very long time since she'd navigated this territory of subtle meanings and possibilities. They reached the Wilsons' gate, where the children were already waiting impatiently. As Margaret called them to come inside, Zachary cleared his throat. "I've been meaning to tell you," he said. "The interior work's coming along faster than expected. If all goes well, you might be able to move in before Christmas." "Really?" Margaret couldn't hide her delight at the prospect. "That would be wonderful. The Wilsons have been so kind, but it isn't home," he finished for her. "I understand. We'll push to make it happen." As December arrived, bringing cooler weather but still no snow to the high desert around Lordsburg, the interior of Margaret's new home and shop took shape. Floors were laid, walls plastered and painted, a new stove installed. Local women organized a furnishing shower, providing essentials to replace what had been lost in the fire. Throughout it all, Zachary remained the constant, directing the work with quiet authority and often completing the most difficult tasks himself. Margaret noticed that he seemed to be putting extra care into the upstairs room that would eventually be his, installing built-in shelves and a small writing desk that he crafted himself from leftover lumber. "You're creating quite a comfortable space up there," she remarked one afternoon as she brought coffee to the workers. "Figure if I'm paying rent, I might as well make it worth the money," he replied with a wink. 2 weeks before Christmas, Sheriff Davis appeared at the construction site with news. "Caught those firebugs," he announced. "Over in Silver City. They were bragging about the blaze they'd set in a saloon there." "Will they be brought back to Lordsburg for trial?" Margaret asked. The sheriff shook his head. "They'll face justice in Silver City. First killed a man in that fire, but they've confessed to setting the one here as well, so there's no doubt about it." "Doesn't change what happened," Zachary said, his expression hardening. "But at least they won't be burning any more families out of their homes." Margaret nodded, finding unexpected closure in the knowledge that those responsible had been caught. It wouldn't bring back her possessions or undo the trauma her children had experienced, but there was something healing about justice being served. That evening, as she helped Emma and Thomas prepare for bed in the Wilsons' guest room, Margaret shared the news with them. "Does that mean the bad men will be punished?" Thomas asked, his young face solemn. "Yes, they will," Margaret assured him. "Sheriff Davis says they'll go to prison for a very long time." "Good," Emma said with unusual vehemence. "They almost made us die." Margaret gathered her daughter close. "But we didn't die, did we? We're all safe, and soon we'll have a new home, an even better one." "Because Mr. Zach saved us," Thomas added. "And now he's building our house. Will he still live with us when it's done, Mama?" Margaret smoothed her son's hair, considering her response carefully. "Mr. Yates will rent the room upstairs, yes. He'll be our neighbor." "I wish he could be more than a neighbor," Emma said with the directness of childhood. "Sarah Miller at school has a new papa. Her real papa died like ours did, but now she has a new one who takes her fishing." The innocent comment struck Margaret speechless for a moment. She had been so focused on practical matters rebuilding, ensuring her children's physical security, that she hadn't considered how they might view Zachary's constant presence in their lives. "Mr. Yates is our friend," she said finally. "A very good friend who has helped us enormously, but that's different from being a father." Thomas looked unconvinced. "He teaches me things like Papa used to, and he makes you smile, Mama. You didn't smile much before the fire." Margaret was saved from responding by Martha Wilson calling that it was time to extinguish the lamps. She tucked the children in with kisses and promises of another day's progress on their new home, but their words stayed with her as she retired to the small sitting room downstairs. Had she been smiling more? It was true that despite the trauma and hardship of recent weeks, she had felt more alive than she had in years. The rebuilding project had given her purpose, and Zachary's steady presence had provided a security she hadn't realized she was missing. But to think beyond friendship, to consider the possibility of remarriage, was a step Margaret wasn't sure she was ready to take. William had been gone 5 years, yes, but she had constructed a life that worked without a husband. Taking in a boarder was one thing. Opening her heart again was another matter entirely. The week before Christmas brought a flurry of activity as the final touches were put on Margaret's new home. Furniture was moved in, curtains hung, kitchen implements arranged. The front portion that would eventually become her millinery shop again was left open for now, awaiting inventory and fixtures that would have to be ordered from back east. On December 23rd, Zachary announced that the house was ready for occupation. "Nothing left but to move you folks in," he said, a note of pride evident in his voice as he showed Margaret through the completed structure. It was beautiful, simple, but solid, with clever touches throughout that showed Zachary's attention to detail. The kitchen had generous windows to capture the southern light. The children's rooms were painted in cheerful colors. The stove had been positioned to heat both the downstairs shop and, through a system of vents, the upstairs living quarters. "I don't know how to thank you," Margaret said, overwhelmed by emotion as she stood in what would be her new bedroom. "This is far better than what we had before." Seeing you and the little ones with a roof over your heads again is thanks enough, Zachary replied, though a faint color rose in his tanned cheeks at her praise. That afternoon, with the help of several townspeople, Margaret and the children moved their few possessions from the Wilsons' home to the new house. By evening, they were settled enough for Margaret to prepare a simple supper in her own kitchen for the first time in nearly 2 months. She had naturally included Zachary in the meal invitation, and as they sat around the new table, another community donation, Margaret felt a sense of rightness that had been missing from her life for longer than she cared to admit. "When will you move your things in?" Thomas asked Zachary between mouthfuls of stew. Zachary glanced at Margaret before answering. "Well, son, I thought I'd give you folks a few days to get settled first. Christmas is coming and you should have that time just as a family." "But you are family," Emma insisted with childish logic. "You saved us and built our house." Margaret saw the flash of emotion in Zachary's eyes before he masked it with a smile. "That's mighty kind of you to say, Miss Emma, but proper families are a bit more official than that." The conversation moved on to Christmas plans, but Margaret found herself reflecting on Emma's words and Zachary's response. There was a yearning in his tone that matched something awakening in her own heart, a desire for connection, for belonging, that went beyond practical arrangements of tenancy and rebuilt walls. After supper, once the children were tucked into their new beds, Margaret and Zachary sat before the fireplace, enjoying the warmth and the quiet. "It feels like a miracle," Margaret said softly, gazing around the cozy room. "2 months ago, I thought we had lost everything. Now we have this beautiful home and the children are happy and—" She trailed off, suddenly self-conscious. "And," Zachary prompted gently. Margaret met his eyes, gathering her courage. "And I've found something I didn't expect to find again, a sense of possibility, of hope." Zachary set down his coffee cup, his expression serious. "Margaret, there's something I should tell you. I received a telegram yesterday from Fort Bowie. The scouting position I mentioned, they're still interested. They've asked me to report after the new year." The news struck her like a physical blow, though she tried not to show it. "I see. That's good news for you, isn't it? The opportunity you were looking for when you came through Lordsburg. It's good pay," he acknowledged, "and work I know how to do." "Then you should take it," Margaret said, forcing brightness into her voice. "We'll manage here just fine. You've given us everything we need to make a fresh start." Zachary studied her face for a long moment. "Is that what you want, for me to go?" The directness of the question caught her off guard. "What I want doesn't signify," she said carefully. "You've fulfilled your commitment here, more than fulfilled it. You have your own life to lead." "That's not an answer," he said, his voice low and intense. "Margaret, when I came to Lordsburg, I was just passing through. Another town on an endless road. But then that fire happened and I found something I didn't know I was looking for." "What was that?" she asked, barely above a whisper. "A purpose. A place that felt worth staying for." He leaned forward, his eyes never leaving hers. "People worth staying for." Margaret's heart raced. "Zachary," a small sound from the stairway interrupted her. They both turned to see Thomas standing there in his nightshirt, looking sheepish. "I can't sleep," he admitted. "It's too quiet here after the Wilsons. Their house always made creaky noises." Margaret rose, grateful for the interruption that gave her a moment to compose herself. "Come on, then. I'll sit with you until you fall asleep." As she led Thomas back upstairs, she glanced over her shoulder at Zachary, who remained by the fire, his expression thoughtful. Whatever confession or declaration had been building between them would have to wait. It wasn't until Christmas Eve that they had another opportunity for private conversation. The day had been busy with final preparations for the holiday. Margaret had used some of her carefully hoarded savings to purchase small gifts for the children, and she had spent the afternoon baking cookies and bread to create at least some semblance of their usual Christmas traditions. Zachary had been absent most of the day, saying only that he had errands to run. He returned as dusk was falling, stomping snow from his boots, the first real snowfall of the season having begun around noon. "Smells like heaven in here," he said appreciatively as he hung his coat by the door. "Just some baking," Margaret replied, pleased nonetheless by his praise. "The children are excited about the snow. They've been watching it from the windows all afternoon." "It's coming down pretty steadily," Zachary confirmed. "Might have a white Christmas after all." There was something different about him, a suppressed energy, a brightness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Margaret wondered if it had to do with his plans to leave for Fort Bowie, a subject neither of them had raised again since that interrupted conversation by the fire. After supper, Margaret sent the children upstairs to prepare for bed, promising that they could hang their stockings before retiring. Once they were out of earshot, Zachary cleared his throat. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his pocket. "For all of you, really, but—" He handed her a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. Margaret took it with surprise. "You didn't need to get us anything. You've already done so much. Open it," he encouraged. "Please." Margaret carefully untied the string and unfolded the paper to reveal a small wooden box, beautifully crafted from polished cherry wood. When she opened it, a soft melody began to play, a lullaby she recognized, as one she often sang to Emma and Thomas. "It's beautiful," she breathed, watching the tiny mechanism turn inside. "How did you—" "Had it ordered from El Paso," Zachary explained. "Sent the sheet music ahead a few weeks back and asked them to set it to the mechanism. It just arrived yesterday." Margaret was touched beyond words at the thoughtfulness of the gift, not just the music box itself, but the fact that he had noticed which song she sang to her children and gone to such lengths to preserve it for them. "I have something else as well," he continued, reaching into his pocket again. "This one's just for you." The second package was even smaller. Margaret unwrapped it with fingers that trembled slightly to find a delicate silver brooch in the shape of a bird taking flight. "Oh, Zachary," she whispered, running a finger over the intricate metalwork. "Reminded me of you," he said simply. "Rising from the ashes, building something new." Margaret looked up at him, no longer able to deny the emotions his presence stirred in her. "Thank you. I'll treasure it always." "Margaret," he began, his voice serious, "I need to tell you something." "About Fort Bowie," her heart sank. "You're leaving after Christmas." To her surprise, he shook his head. "I turned it down, sent a telegram this morning declining the position." "But why?" "It was the opportunity you came here for." Zachary moved closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his hazel eyes. "I found a better one. If you'll have me, that is." "Have you?" Margaret repeated, hardly daring to understand his meaning. "I'm not proposing tenancy anymore," he clarified, taking her hands in his. "Though I'll understand if that's all you want to offer. But these past weeks, getting to know you and the children, helping build not just a house but a home, it's shown me what I've been missing all these years on the drift." Margaret felt tears welling in her eyes. "What about your wandering spirit? You've never stayed in one place for long. Maybe I just never found the right place, or the right people." His thumbs traced gentle patterns on the backs of her hands. "I love you, Margaret, and I've grown to love those children like they were my own. I'm asking if you might consider allowing me to be more than your tenant, more than your friend." The words, so longed for and yet so unexpected, left Margaret speechless for a moment. When she found her voice, it came out husky with emotion. "The children would be overjoyed," she said. "They already adore you. And their mother," Zachary asked softly. "What does she feel?" Instead of answering with words, Margaret rose on tiptoe and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative with the newness of rediscovered feelings, but it deepened as Zachary's arms came around her, drawing her closer. When they finally separated, both a little breathless, Margaret rested her forehead against his chest, listening to the strong, steady beat of his heart. "Is that a yes?" he asked, a smile in his voice. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes to everything." A delighted squeal from the stairway told them their private moment hadn't been as private as they'd thought. Emma and Thomas tumbled into the room, their faces alight with excitement. "Are you going to be our new papa?" Thomas demanded, looking up at Zachary with hopeful eyes. Zachary crouched down to the boy's level. "If your mama agrees to marry me, and if you and your sister would like me to be, then yes, I'd be honored to be your father." Emma threw her arms around Zachary's neck. "I knew you would stay. I asked Santa for it in my letter." Zachary's laugh was warm as he hugged the little girl. "Well, I wouldn't want to disappoint Santa." Looking up at Margaret, his eyes full of promise, he added, "Or any of you, not ever." As snow fell softly outside the windows of their new home, Margaret Prentiss realized that from the tragedy of fire had come a gift she had never expected to receive again, a second chance at love, and the completion of her family in a way she had stopped believing was possible. The following spring found Lordsburg blossoming not just with wildflowers across the desert landscape, but with new growth in the town itself. The buildings destroyed in the fire had all been rebuilt, in many cases better than before. Margaret's millinery shop had reopened in February, stocked with the latest fashions ordered from catalogs, and a trip she and Zachary had made to El Paso. Their wedding had taken place on New Year's Day, a simple ceremony in the small church with the children as their attendants and the whole town in celebration. Sheriff Davis had given the bride away, and Martha Wilson had wept happy tears throughout the service. The upstairs room that had originally been intended as Zachary's rental space had been repurposed as a workshop where he crafted furniture, a skill he had developed during his years of travel that now provided a steady secondary income for the family. His pieces were gaining a reputation throughout the territory for their quality and artistic touches. On a warm May afternoon, Margaret stood in the doorway of her shop, watching as Zachary taught Thomas to ride the small pony they had purchased for his 8th birthday. Emma sat nearby, sketching the scene with the colored pencils that had been Zachary's gift to her. The past 6 months had transformed them all. Thomas had grown an inch and developed a confidence that reminded Margaret of his father, both fathers, the one he had lost and the one who had found him. Emma had emerged from her shell of shyness, flourishing under Zachary's patient encouragement of her artistic talents, and Margaret herself felt renewed, not just as a woman in love, but as a person with dreams and aspirations beyond mere survival. Zachary had awakened that in her, his belief in her abilities giving her the courage to expand the shop to include dressmaking services that were already proving popular. As she watched her husband, the word still gave her a thrill: lift Thomas from the pony and set him on his feet with a congratulatory ruffle of his hair. Margaret's hand drifted unconsciously to her midsection. She hadn't told Zachary yet about the new life growing within her, wanting to be certain before sharing the news. But that morning's nausea, the 3rd in a row, had convinced her. By Christmas, their family would number 5 instead of 4. The thought filled her with a quiet joy that complemented the more vibrant happiness of their daily life together. Zachary looked up, catching her gaze from across the street, and the smile that spread across his face made her heart flutter just as it had the first time he'd turned that focused attention on her. He said something to Thomas, who nodded eagerly and took the pony's reins, leading the animal toward the small stable behind their home with all the seriousness of his new responsibility. "You're looking mighty pretty standing there in the sunshine, Mrs. Yates," Zachary said as he approached, his voice carrying the same Texas drawl that had become one of her favorite sounds in the world. "And you're looking mighty dusty, Mr. Yates," she replied with a laugh, brushing some dirt from his shoulder. "How's the riding lesson going?" "The boy's a natural," Zachary said proudly. "Takes to it like he was born in the saddle. I'm glad. It means so much to him, learning these things from you." Zachary's expression softened. "They're good kids, Margaret. You did a fine job with them before I ever came along." "We're all better together," she said simply, reaching for his hand. "Speaking of which, I have something to tell you." But before she could continue, a commotion down the street caught their attention. A rider was approaching at speed, his horse lathered with exertion. As he drew closer, they recognized one of the young men who worked at the telegraph office. "Mr. Yates," he called, reining in his mount. "Got an urgent message for you from the Rangers in Texas." Zachary frowned, accepting the telegram the young man thrust toward him. As he read it, his expression grew serious. "What is it?" Margaret asked, a flutter of concern rising in her chest. "My old captain," Zachary explained, folding the paper and tucking it into his pocket. "He's tracking a gang that murdered a family near Fort Worth. They're headed this way, likely aiming for the border. He's asking if I can assist when they reach this area." Margaret's initial reaction was fear not of the danger, necessarily, but of what it might awaken in Zachary. The call of his former life, the pull of the open trail. For a moment she was back in December, hearing him speak of the Fort Bowie position, terrified of losing him before she'd truly found him. But Zachary seemed to read her thoughts, for he took her hands in his gaze steady and reassuring. "I'd need to send a response. Tell me what you want me to say, and that's what I'll do." The simple statement, the unhesitating deference to her wishes, dissolved Margaret's fears. This was not the restless cowboy who had drifted into Lordsburg last October. This was her husband, a man who had chosen roots and family with full awareness of what he was embracing. "How dangerous would it be?" she asked practically. "Depends," he admitted. "Mostly they'd want me for tracking, knowing the territory, but these men sound desperate." Margaret considered for a moment. "Then you should help, but come home to us when it's done." Zachary's relief was evident. "Always," he promised. "This is where I belong now." He turned to the waiting messenger. "Tell Captain Browning I'll meet him when he reaches Lordsburg. But I won't be leaving the territory." As the young man rode off, Zachary turned back to Margaret. "Now, what was it you wanted to tell me before we were interrupted?" Margaret smiled, taking his hand and placing it gently against her still flat stomach. "Just that our family is growing again. Come Christmas, there'll be a new Yates in the world." The joy that transformed Zachary's face was something Margaret knew she would remember all her days. Pure happiness, mingled with wonder and a fierce protectiveness, that told her, more clearly than any words, that she had chosen well when she had opened her heart to this man who had once climbed through a window to save her children from fire. "A baby," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Our baby." "Our family," Margaret corrected gently, "with a new beginning." As he gathered her into his arms, mindful of curious eyes on the public street but unable to contain his happiness, Margaret reflected on the strange and wonderful journey that had brought them to this moment. From the tragedy of fire had come not just rebuilding, but rebirth, a love story written not in grand gestures but in the daily acts of care and commitment that had transformed two broken paths into one shared journey. Their home stood strong and secure, a testament to what could be built from ashes with determination and hope. But it was the family within those walls that was the true miracle, the children who had gained a father, the man who had found his place, and the woman who had rediscovered the courage to love again. As summer deepened into autumn, and autumn gave way to another winter, life in Lordsburg continued its rhythm, altered now by the presence of one small but significant addition. James William Yates arrived 2 weeks before Christmas, a healthy, robust boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's blue eyes. Emma and Thomas had taken to their roles as older siblings with enthusiasm, helping Margaret with the baby and proudly showing him off to anyone who would look. Zachary, for his part, seemed perpetually amazed by his son, spending long hours simply holding the infant while he worked on designs for new furniture pieces. The assistance he had provided to his former captain had ended successfully, with the outlaws captured before they could cross into Mexico. Zachary had returned home with a renewed appreciation for the life he had chosen, telling Margaret that while the excitement of the chase had been familiar, it had lacked the depth of satisfaction he found in the quieter moments with her and the children. On Christmas Eve, 1 year to the day since Zachary had given Margaret the music box and confessed his love, the family gathered in their home, now decorated with evergreen boughs and candles. The shop below was closed for the holiday, the town quiet under a light blanket of snow that had fallen the night before. As Margaret nursed baby James by the fire, watching Thomas and Emma play chess on the set Zachary had carved for them, she felt a contentment so complete it brought tears to her eyes. Zachary, noticing, moved from his workbench to sit beside her. "Happy tears, I hope?" he asked softly, his hand gently stroking their son's downy head. "The happiest," she assured him. "I was just thinking about last Christmas and how much has changed in a year." "All for the better," Zachary said, his gaze taking in their children, their home, the life they had built together. "All for the better," Margaret agreed, leaning against his solid strength. "Though I still wonder sometimes at the chance that brought you to Lordsburg exactly when we needed you most." "Not chance," Zachary corrected gently. "Providence. Like I told you that day at the construction site, some things are meant to be." As if in agreement, baby James released his hold on Margaret's breast with a contented sigh, milk-drunk and drowsy. Zachary carefully took him, cradling him with practiced ease while Margaret adjusted her clothing. "I have something for you," she said, reaching for a package hidden beneath her chair. "An early Christmas gift." Zachary raised an eyebrow. "Thought we agreed to wait until morning." "This one seemed appropriate for tonight," she replied with a smile. Balancing James in one arm, Zachary unwrapped the package with his free hand, revealing a leather-bound book. Opening it, he found pages filled with Margaret's neat handwriting, interspersed with Emma's drawings. "It's our story," Margaret explained. "From the fire to today. I thought James should know it someday how our family came to be." Zachary's throat worked as he swallowed hard, emotion evident in his eyes as he carefully turned the pages. "It's perfect," he said finally, his voice rough. "The perfect gift." "Not quite perfect," Margaret corrected, turning to the last written page. "There's still plenty of story left to tell." The blank pages that followed represented their future together, a future that had seemed impossible on that October night when flames threatened to take everything from them, but which now stretched before them, full of promise and possibility. "We'll fill them together," Zachary promised, leaning forward to seal the words with a kiss that held all the tenderness and passion of their journey. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and silent against the windows of the home they had built from ashes not just of wood and stone, but of hope reborn and love rekindled. as enduring as the vast New Mexico sky above them, and as precious as the family they had forged together in the heart of the wild frontier.